Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mind Matters. On today's show, we're going to be discussing postmodern politics. And when I think of postmodern politics, I think of Groucho Marx's definition of politics in general, when he said that it is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying all of the wrong remedies. When you think about politics today, mostly on the left side of the spectrum, with all of the talk about whether transgendered men should be able to abort children that they can't have, and all of these different kinds of crazy topics. It makes you wonder what the heck is going on. Is it just, like I said, the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedies? Is that a sign of madness, hysteria? Is it stupidity? Is it just the human condition that we just don't know what's going on and sometimes we go off the rails? Or is there something a little bit more involved? Is there something, more sinister? Is there a more sinister element, a strategy involved in terms of, duping people and using confusion in order to gain power? So on today's show, we're going to be taking a look at a chapter from the philosopher Stephen Hicks's book, Explaining Postmodernism. And it's chapter 6. He discusses postmodern strategy. And he kind of dissects all of the premises that postmodernism is based on, and then looks at it in terms of how it could be used to benefit an agent, gaining some sort of power for whatever reason, just in order to accrue power to yourself. Why is it that there are so many contradictions in, the postmodern way of thinking? Whether it's, that tolerance is good and dominance is bad, except for when we dominate everyone. Like, technology is bad and destructive, but it's unfair that, people don't have equal access to technology, so we have to get technology to as many people as possible. Values are subjective, but sexism and racism are totally bad, and that there's no actual such thing as truth, but we postmodernists can tell it like it is, because that's the truth. We know the truth, but there is no such thing as truth. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. Harrison, where do you want to take it from there?
Well, I think one of the things I most liked about this chapter was how Hicks looks at the explanations for why the stuff is going on. Being a philosopher, philosophers are very ordered in the way they think and lay out their points. So he, in the previous part of the book, he looks at kind of the origins of some of the ideas that came together to lead to, what we call postmodernism, certain epistemological views and then views on the nature of reality too. But why they coalesced in the form that they did and how they're linked up with the politics. So he's kind of trying to reason out the possible reasons for how this took the shape that it did. And so he gives a few different possibilities. One is that I think this was the Kierkegaardian and or Kantian response. I don't know if Kant was included in this one, but as a kind of reaction to, more generally, as a kind of reaction to having your sacred cow butchered, which is it's kind of like a self-defensive mechanism to take a skeptical epistemological position. So so if you take an example of a person who is in the church and has a traditional worldview in that sense, it's when confronted with the criticisms of your worldview that seem really good, it's a response will be, well, based on this epistemological philosophy, we can't know any of these things to be true, so we can't trust in our reason, so therefore I can be secure in keeping my beliefs, even though I can't defend them against your arguments. And so that would be one reason for taking this kind of skeptical view of epistemology. And then another response would be, or another reason for the commingling of this skeptical epistemology with leftist politics would be the Machiavellian response. So, well, to back up a bit, first we have to make that connection. So So it's just he observes, looking at these philosophers and the way things have gone, that that postmodernism, like the philosophy, the philosophical currents that come together in this skepticism, seem tied with leftist politics, but not so much politics on the right. It seems to be like this union of leftist, like socialist politics, with skepticism. So taking that, then he asks, well, how do we explain that? So there are a few ways that we can a few ways in which someone can come to a skeptical position, and the response as like the self-defense mechanism was one of them. But once you have this link between the politics and the philosophy, then you have multiple potential motivations for that. And so one would be, well, so you have to look at how those two things are weighted. And the way he breaks it down is either the epistemology is primary and the politics are just secondary, or the politics are primary and the epistemology is secondary, or they're kind of equal. And if they're equal, then you're just kind of in a state of confusion and contradiction. So, which is possible because people are contradictory and believe contradictory things. But he looks at these three examples and tries to figure out which one seems more plausible. And the first one, that is, if the epistemology is primary, so these are people who really are true believers in extreme skepticism, that we can't really know anything, reason doesn't really exist, truth is relative or doesn't exist, etc. Like all these kind of relativistic and skeptical positions. That is the main thing that they are that they believe, that's their position, essentially, their party platform. But he kind of makes just kind of dispatches that one pretty easily because of the observation that it's intimately tied with left-wing politics. Because if it was just the epistemology that was most important, then you'd get all kinds of political positions that are tied with that epistemology. So you'd get a wide diversity of political opinions tied to that skeptical epistemology. But you don't have that. You have it intimately tied with leftist politics. So he says that's unlikely. What's more likely would be either one of the next two options. So the second one would be that the politics is the most important thing. That the postmodernists' position, their core beliefs and core values essentially are in the political domain, in their political positions, and the epistemology must come secondary. And that's I think you'd have to choose that in probably in any example where you have someone who is this is just one example of when you take anyone who has like a skeptical epistemology like that, there are going to be fundamental beliefs that are beneath that like veneer of skepticism, regardless of whether it's politics or just some other kind of like implicit philosophical like presuppositions. In the case of politics, though, you can identify a specific political position, and that is all the things that come along with the leftist politics for the past like 50 years or more. So you can see that in just the direction that their politics have been going. So it's the core evils in the world are racism, sexism, transgenderism, etc. All the isms, and fascism, and those are the primary concerns. And the epistemology isn't so important. The skepticism isn't so important. So what Hicks argues in these sections of this chapter is that the epistemology seems more like a rhetorical device. It's a persuasion technique. It's a way of winning the argument without having to win the argument. So it's basically just putting your opponent on the defensive. So you aren't really convinced that skepticism, is a valid kind of philosophical position. You just you use it when it's not necessary, when it's convenient to use it. So if you're having an argument with someone and they've actually got decent points that you can't really respond to, well, you ignore the content of those arguments and bring the discussion back to epistemology. It's the academic way. It's the academic version of when you're having an argument with someone and you you can't counter their opinions, so their views. So you just say, "Oh, well, that's just your opinion." It's like, well, how do you respond to that? Well, okay, yeah, maybe it is just my opinion, or well, you can't respond to that because for that person, it's like their evidence won't work. So it becomes, oh, well, that's just your opinion. How do you actually know that to be true? You can't actually know that to be true. And so then, because quantum physics proves it, or or relativity theory proves it, so you get into a discussion on epistemology and how we can know things and how we can know whether things are true or whether truth even exists. And you've totally sidestepped the actual maybe like policy issue that's that's in contention. So this is what Hicks calls the kind of the Machiavellian strategy. It is purely a power game on the part of the person using this skepticism in a political argument, basically. So it's basically just a way of getting your opponent to shut up and to kind of to win the argument without actually winning the argument. Mm-hmm. And that's the main purpose of it. It's not to engage in any kind of like actual debate about the issues at hand. It's to just totally undercut any of the arguments from the beginning by blocking off any discussion of it because there's no use talking about it because A, B, and C. So that's the kind of, well, that's the Machiavellian strategy. Did you have something to say about it?
Well, yeah. I mean, the implications of this are immense. And as I was reading this chapter, I was thinking that there are so many individuals right now in the left, in the US and elsewhere, who have adopted these strategies, maybe not even ever having read any material on postmodernism. It's permeated academia in the US and in the West. It's become part of the very fabric, I think, of political, social, and cultural discourse in the West as well. And we've referred to this interview many times on the show before, but a perfect example of what you were describing just now, Harrison, was evident in the interview that Kathy Newman gave with Jordan Peterson about a year and a half ago, where there was this constant attempt to knock him on his heels and just try and subvert and undercut anything he was trying to say. So, her whole goal wasn't to bring out any new information or data or to learn anything, but simply to be able to diminish Jordan Peterson and his message. And the message he was delivering was largely based on history and facts and failures of certain movements like socialism, like Marxism, quite often in the 20th century. And that I think is one of the main reasons why looking at Hicks's information and the idea of postmodernism, or the ideas espoused by postmodernism, are kind of crucial to getting behind or understanding these things that we're seeing today. There's an important distinction that he makes early on in the chapter, I think, which also reminded me a bit of what the Kathy Newmans of the world represent and what the Jordan Petersons of the world represent. Hicks writes, "For the modernist, the functionality of language is complementary to its being cognitive. An individual observes reality perceptually, forms conceptual beliefs about reality on the basis of those perceptions, and then acts in reality on the basis of those perceptual and conceptual cognitive states. Some of those actions in the world are social interactions, and in some of those social interactions, language assumes a communicatory function. In communicating with each other, individuals narrate, argue, or otherwise attempt to pass on their cognitive beliefs about the world. Rhetoric, then, is an aspect of language's communicatory function, referring to those methods of using language that aid in the effectiveness of cognition during linguistic communication. For the postmodernist, language cannot be cognitive because it does not connect to reality, whether to an external nature or an underlying self. Language is not about being aware of the world, or about distinguishing the true from the false, or even about argument in the traditional sense of validity, soundness, and probability. Accordingly, postmodernism recasts the nature of rhetoric. Rhetoric is persuasion in the absence of cognition. So the way he's framing this is that there is a whole, and he gets into this a little further, there's this whole kind of postmodern approach to discussion, to debate, towards communication, which rests upon the never-ending subjective analysis of language, and the language used to describe the meaning of language, and the language used to describe the meaning of the language that's being used to describe the meaning of the language. It's like this kind of Schrodinger's cat of meaning. And ultimately, what he gets to here is that there is a nihilistic mindset at the root of all of this. That there is no value for or affirmation of an objective truth or real facts that can be ascertained and shared among postmodernists, and that's one of the big tensions that we're seeing right now among many of the more radically liberal and versus the kind of mainstream conservative, middle of the road person who is just trying to keep their head above water against all of this kind of onslaught of politically correct and leftist arguments, because there is no winning. There isn't even a common language or a common language that can be used between two people that come from these opposite ends of the spectrum. And this is what Jonathan Haidt has gotten into without explicitly calling it postmodernism. He'll ascribe moral taste buds to this dichotomy between the two political spectrums. But really, what we're seeing here is an outgrowth of postmodernist thinking at its worst.
Well, the one thing that is really striking to me is like how you're describing. You brought up Kathy Newman, and you brought up just a number of different examples of how this rhetorical strategy plays out. And if it is all political, if primarily, as you pointed out, Harrison, it is political, the politics drives the epistemology, or rather uses that epistemology to divert attention away from the politics. It's like, if your goals are so noble as you see them, why can you not be upfront about them? If social justice is really your primary goal and you want to help people, why is it that you feel like you must resort to constant lying and shifting and covert aggression if it is true that social justice is what you're after? And I think that what you're looking at there is that to the person who's really accepted that you can't be upfront or truthful or honest, that you are looking at someone who is really at war with the world in some way. They see themselves as a revolutionary, and they see themselves as against a power structure, against something that's so big, or against society, basically against society, against reality, that you can't be upfront, you can't be truthful, because you're in it for some long march through the institutions or something like that, something to that effect. And if you really believe that, I mean, it's just such a bizarre way to view human relations. You know, that it's all about, you know, power games. It seems like, you know, you're just some covert weird agent, you know, if that's really the way that you see your role in the world. And it's no wonder then that over time you know, the things that you supposedly think that you're fighting for lose all meaning because you've divested them of all meaning. You've divested words, you've divested yourself of all meaning. So then, you know, no wonder then, like in the last 3-4 years, they've just been out screaming at the sky with their pants around their ankles for the most part. But so back to what you were saying about Kathy Newman, I thought, you know, it seemed like she was using like the postmodern technique. I'm not an expert in it, but of deconstruction, where basically you're just trying to take this idea and deconstruct it into its, you know, real parts, like really showing what it really is, so that you can, you know, if you look at Trump, you see him as, you know, he's white, he's rich. You know, he's actually Hitler. You know, you've taken apart, you've divested him of any individuality, any factual reality, and you've taken it and you've applied this, you know, this intersectional model to him, and now you can say he's actually Hitler. And Hicks talks about the use of this strategy in this chapter because it's not, you know, obviously you're not saying like he's actually Hitler, but you are saying he's actually Hitler, but you might not believe it. But as he says, if you hate someone and want to hurt him, then you hit him where it counts. Do you want to hurt a man who loves his children and hates child molesters? Drop hints and spread rumors that he is fond of child pornography. Do you want to hurt a woman who takes pride in her independence? Spread the word that she married the man she did because he is wealthy. The truth or falsity of the rumors does not matter, and whether those you tell believe you does not really matter. What matters is that you score a direct, damaging hit to someone's psyche. You know that those accusations and rumors will cause tremors, even if they come to nothing. And I think that's, you know, they have journals, entire journals devoted to identifying the, you know, the real sexist nature to the hot dog industry, or how ice cream is actually racist, or, you know, I can't remember those three scholars who published, can't remember the names of the scholars who published all those papers in those journals, that whole controversy that erupted not too long ago. But it's because they found the language that you could use, and people bought it because it made sense to them. You know, it's just, it's bizarre.
Yeah, he gives the example of the SoCal Affair, which was an earlier version of that type of hoax, where, you know, this was a physicist who published an article in a leftist journal on how, what was it that physics, physics or leftist politics like proves or gives an example of like quantum physics or something. And it was a hoax. Like he did it pretty much as a joke, and it got published, and there was a big controversy of it. And so these academics that you're referring to did a similar thing recently, and Jordan Peterson interviewed them about it, and they got a lot of media play over it, but it was funny. So yeah, too bad we can't remember them. But if you just search like, hoax leftist journal articles or something, you should be able to find it. But they were pretty funny. But that's an example of this. It's like a symptom of the problem that you identified, of this inability to, or unwillingness to, just be honest. And I think that's actually the biggest sign that something is deeply wrong, like in this whole movement, that lack of honesty. Because to me, it's a tell, like it's a sign that these people know that they can't be honest because they won't be able to justify their position. They won't be able to actually win an argument or persuade people, like using truthful language of the rightness of their of their beliefs and of their aspirations. Essentially, it's a tacit admission that their strategy and their policy is somehow totally wrong-headed and not feasible. and it's also it's like I think that's where the seed of like totalitarianism is, because there's this this unwillingness or inability to tell the truth about your motivations and what you actually want, but also like because of that, that opens the door for like the terrorization, like that quote that you just read, like that what you just described is it's like a method of psychological terror to take an opponent and to then like you said. So let's say there's like a man who prides himself on the love of his children and genuinely like loves his children. Well, what's the worst thing you can do to that man is then, well, to plant the seed of the rumor that he's actually a pedophile in some way. And it's like that level of like psychological terror is psychopathic. It's like that's the type of thing that a psychopath would do. Because it's one of the, I think it's one of the worst sins that you can do is to tell a lie about someone like to that degree. Like everyone can like come to a wrong understanding of someone because they just for whatever reason, right? Like you can truly believe that someone who's innocent is guilty for whatever reason, whether it's through a certain type of media coverage or that person just being in the wrong place at the wrong time and circumstances really making them look guilty. You see this all the time with with murder trials and things like that in the media, where people, like I talked about last week, where people come to a conclusion about something, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, that they aren't really justified coming to a conclusion to. But that doesn't stop people from having their opinions, right? Everyone's got their opinion on everything, even when they don't have enough data, enough of the actual evidence to justify having any opinion on it, essentially. So that's one thing. Like that's just human nature. But to then take that to the extreme of actively telling a lie, like something that you know to be false, like and to direct it in such a way at the person's at a person's virtue. That it's just like it's just truly reprehensible, and that is the MO of the let's say at least a portion of like the political, this political movement, is to tell outright lies about someone in order to destroy them, to destroy their political power, or whatever power they might have in the world, is just to take them out, not through like weapons or violence, but through words. This is what what Hicks comes back to repeatedly in this chapter, is that it is the use of words as a weapon. It's because he even goes into that Nietzsche quote, right, about the weak and the strong, and how like the mentalities associated with the slave mentality and the master mentality, and like the mentality of the weak, and how like the weak don't have much recourse, to they'll lose a fight essentially with the strong. So what are they left with? Well, they're left with words. So when you take when you have that mentality, that's what you're left with. Is you're left with the ability to use your words, your speech, in order to destroy a person. And to anyone who's ever had like a big lie told about themselves, like they know not only how it feels, but the real life consequences that play themselves out because of something like that. And it's only like a very lucky person that manages to get through something like that relatively unscathed. But that right there, that, like I talked about it being like the seeds of totalitarianism. Well, it's there too. It's like that is the mentality of like a totalitarian like police state, like the judicial or the legal system in a pathocracy, is to destroy a person not because of the crimes that they've done, but because of their virtue. And essentially their virtue has become a crime in that system. And because the people now in power don't see that as a virtue, they see virtue as a crime. They see it as something that is reprehensible. And this ties back to the three possibilities for this, the tying together of this philosophy with this politics, is like there's the Machiavellian one, which I kind of described a bit, and then the third one, which is just you believe both of them. It's just this kind of like inner contradictory like state of cognitive dissonance that you're in, which as I said, that's normal too. Like people do believe contradictory things. So I think if we like put this in a ponerological like perspective, if we go back to Political Ponerology by Andrew Lobachevsky and look at what's going on here, it's like I'd guess that even the majority of people who hold like the postmodern leftist belief system, see it as being true in some way, that they actually do. Some part of them believes both things to be true. On 3 days of the week, they're skeptical in their epistemology. They believe that there's no such thing as truth, and that no one opinion is better than the other. And on the other 3 days, or 3 other days of the week, they actually believe that they're right, that their beliefs are true, and that certain things are good or bad. And then maybe on Sunday they do whatever they want. Maybe they've got another set of beliefs, but that's what normal people tend to be like. They don't really think things through very much. It's like you talk to most people, they'll hold 10. You can have a conversation with someone where they espouse 10 contradictory beliefs in the space of a short conversation. It's like it's pretty normal. So I think that's where the majority of people are. It's like they've basically been indoctrinated into this this philosophy. So I took one of my university courses was a religious studies course. And it was kind of like introduction to the study of religion or something like that. So every lecture was a different approach to the study of religion, like from a historical perspective. So, so there was the sociological perspective, the Marxist perspective, the history of religion's perspective, etc. And so it was getting to the end of the semester, and we hadn't gone through the whole textbook. So our professor kind of gave the class the option. He's like, okay, we've got a few chapters left, so I'm going to leave it open to you guys. Do you want the I think there was I can't remember what one of the options was, but there was one option that seemed kind of, well, the class didn't think it was very interesting, but then there was the postmodernist feminist option, and everyone's like, oh yeah, we want to do that one. And he's like, well, okay. So he did that. He gave that lecture, the next week, and afterwards he said, yeah, you guys, do you regret your decisions? Like you're probably wishing that we did the other one. And everyone's like, yeah, because it was so crazy, right? So, and even just from that one class of the postmodern perspective, if you imagine, well, I can imagine now taking a whole like series of classes, a whole set of classes where that is the predominant, narrative, and it would be like mind torture to go through that for more than a single lecture, and so I can easily imagine, all these students going through their classes, and then in class you're basically told, oh well, here's the way it is, and and that gains converts. It's like it won't convert everyone, but people will go through their courses, and it just becomes like it's just the air that they're breathing now. That. It's the language they now speak, and it just forms the kind of like it just forms the shape of their thoughts into that shape from now on. So you talk to people who have like majored in these liberal arts courses or degrees, and that's just the way they speak. It's like it's kind of the unquestioned like base of their worldview, or just the unquestioned premises of their new worldview. And it'll so they'll state it, they'll state those beliefs and those premises as if they really believe them, because some part of them does. Even if it's just a very shallow part of their mind, it still believes in these positions. But another part of them will still believe, like you said, that sexism and racism are objectively evil, that their position is objectively true. That it's objectively bad that the third world doesn't have the access to the technology that is objectively bad. So it forms these contradictions that might be obvious to someone who can spot them, because it doesn't take much to spot them, but once you once you see the contradiction, it's very easy to spot, after that. But then so you confront a person with their contradictions. Well, what happens when you confront a person with their contradictions? I mean, probably 99 times out of 100, they're not going to respond rationally. Be like, oh, I never thought about that. That is a deeply contradictory set of beliefs that I'm holding. I'm going to have to question that now, rethink that through to find out, the source of that contradiction and what I have to change about my core beliefs to reconcile that, that position. It's like, no, it's just, screw you. That's just your opinion. I'm going to believe what I want to believe because I'm right. So you have this indoctrination now where you can believe these mutually contradictory things whenever necessary, whenever the opportunity arises where you need one of those positions. It's like, okay, now I need to be a skeptic, so I'm going to be a skeptic. Well, now I need to actually believe in something, so I'm going to believe in something, and that creates like your typical leftist, like far left activist. But where does the Machiavellian come in? So this reminds me of that. Jordan Peterson made this observation several times, and we talked about it on a previous show, but it might have been one of the Ponerology shows, where he was talking about one of the talks that he gave. I think it was in Toronto. I can't remember, but where there was a group of activists that were there. And, and he said, well, most of them were just your average, activists, but there were one or two in there who says were there to cause trouble. Those were, and I'm pretty sure in one of those talks he even said they were probably psychopaths. And because within this milieu, within this postmodernist movement, there are the true Machiavellians. So these are the people for whom the epistemology is just a weapon. These are the people who are aware of their own use of language as a weapon, because they're like psychopaths. It comes naturally to them. It's what they've been doing since they were children. They've been using language as a mask in order to dupe other people into thinking that they care, that they're trustworthy. That they're not heartless bastards, essentially, that will screw you over, as soon as it becomes even slightly beneficial and to the psychopath, and even at times when it's not beneficial, just for the sake of screwing you over. So they're trained liars, essentially, trained and skilled in the ways of using language just to, as an expert lawyer, maybe, trained in the use of rhetoric in order to just convince you of something, knowing full well that their position is not the winning argument, essentially. So those, I'd say that I'd guess that the majority of the people that use that technique that you quoted, from Hicks about the smearing a loving father with the label of being a pedophile, or having some child pornography or whatever, or smearing an independent woman with the idea that she's just a gold digger. Those, like that. That's why I call that a psychopathic thing. It's like, because that's the thing that a psychopath will do without thinking twice. It's just like, well, how do I win? Well, what's the one thing I can do to this person to just totally, completely destroy their life? Well, that's the thing I'm going to do. And it's so that's kind of the reason that this postmodern leftist politics is the perfect breeding ground for not only like psychopathic operators, but for totalitarianism, is that it's created this culture of concealment and lying, and this culture of total lack of respect for the truth. It's because in that environment, like even the relatively normal, or ordinary people, they're already practicing a bit of self-deception and other deception. It's unclear how aware they may be of it, but they're already practicing it. So they're already engaging in the type of arguments like so just trying to shut the person up, just for the sake of shutting them up, because from their postmodern training they know, or a part of them knows that There is no true, like truth or falsehood. It's just competing power games using language which doesn't refer to anything. So it's like, I'm just, okay, so you're getting in an argument with me. I'm now in a power game with you. Here's the way I win the power game. Truth doesn't enter into it. It's not something to be considered because it doesn't exist. It's like, all I know is that I'm in a power game, a conflict with you. And you are the one with the power. You are representing the powerful, like the oppressors. So therefore, I am morally justified in defeating you by any means necessary, because, that's just the way that power games are played. And then hopefully, by defeating you, and by defeating all of you, like my team will then be the ones to have power, and that will be good because we by our very nature, by our class or intersectional nature, are good, and you are evil. So you have this environment now that allows for it's like you let it. Well, what are some of the phrases? Like you give an inch and they take a mile. So you give this this mendaciousness, this mendacity, an inch by leaving behind the respect for truth, and what you get is people who have absolutely no regard for truth and who are completely malevolent, who are then free to operate within this environment. So then you'll get people making claims like that against virtuous people, virtuous people who happen to be like successful. So it's just that's just like that's the seeds for the creation of an eventual pathocracy. That's why this, like a movement like this, that's the trajectory that it's on. It's not going anywhere nice, despite all of the statements about well, how would you describe it? It's like there's this like mask of self-righteousness and of holiness even. It's like, here are the people representing the oppressed, representing the people that are stamped down by the evil, malevolent like rulers of the world. These are the people on the side of good, like the true Christians, even though they don't like religion. It's like, these are the people representing the downtrodden, and wanting cosmic justice. And so how can you criticize that, right? These people are obviously good and holy and angelic, like beings, like bringing like channels of goodness into the world by standing up for the underdog and the oppressed. It's like, so how can you possibly not get behind them? Well, that's the dark aspect of this, is that's how, unfortunately, that's how evil comes into the world. That's how one type of evil comes into the world is through a mask of goodness. It's like, well, I'm representing. So you have look at the position of the psychopath in this, one of these psychopathic activists in this environment. It's like, well, I am adopting the position of goodness for my own aims, so that I can get power, so that I can now exercise that power in a way that the current powers that be, can't even imagine. It's like, I'm going to be 10 times worse than them, and all these suckers that are supporting me don't even realize that that they're going to be the first to the guillotine, because they don't mean anything to me. It's like, that's the environment that is being bred by this use of postmodern philosophy tied to leftist politics. And unfortunately, that's the only way it can go, because like Hicks points out, it's like the leftist politics that is being espoused is this has its roots in the last couple 200 years or so, and like these forms of socialism, and every new form of this socialist philosophy has been disproven, like by history, that it doesn't work. So one of Hicks's arguments is that one of the, like, I went back to Kierkegaard and like the self-defense mechanism of adopting a skeptical position in order to justify one's belief, or in order to justify keeping a belief that has been persuasively argued against in some capacity. So with the socialist position, it's like, here are all these socialist experiments that have failed. And here are all of, like, well, first of all, you've got the theorists. So here are all the philosophers that show why they fail. It's like, well, you can dismiss those. It's like, oh, well, they don't know what they're talking about. We just have to try it and see if it works. So, several countries, dozens and dozens of countries have tried, and it has failed. And dozens of countries have tried to institute this equality. It has failed, like, remarkably. So what is the response to that? The response is, well, there's a quote from Richard Rorty, one of the philosophers. Can you give me page 179? Mm-hmm. I just want to read that because it's kind of a... So Richard Rorty, he's a skeptical philosopher. So he writes... okay, so I'll just read the what Hicks writes before getting to Rorty's quote. So, if one is interested in truth, then one's rational response to a failing theory is as follows. One breaks the theory down into its constituent premises, one questions its premises vigorously and checks the logic that integrates them. One seeks out alternatives to the most questionable premises. One accepts moral responsibility for any bad consequences of putting the false theory into practice. This is not what we find in postmodern reflections on contemporary politics. Truth and rationality are subjected to attack, and the prevailing attitude about moral responsibility is again best stated by Rorty. Quote, "I think that a good left is a party that always thinks about the future and doesn't care much about our past sins." And it's like, okay, well, that's it's just completely idiotic. And totally, like, morally reprehensible, because it's like, well, I'm gonna forget about all the past times that these ideas have failed, and just keep trying, because one of these times it's gonna work. Like, one of these times we're gonna be able to have universal like participatory democracy where things don't spiral down into corruption and mass murder. It's like, well, unfortunately, that's kind of the way things work, because, like, well, that's a whole other discussion on the nature of, it goes back to what Lobachevsky describes about the way societies, like, just structure themselves, the way individuals, like, structure themselves within groups. The ideals, like the utopian vision of these, like, socialist philosophies don't work, because they don't, well, for one, they don't work on that scale. It's impossible for such a system to work on a mass scale, because, like, it'll work among a group of family and friends. It'll work in, like, an Israeli kibbutz. It'll work in a small community where everyone joins voluntarily. The instant, like, the minute you pass, like, several hundred members or 1,000 members, you end up getting individuals that are in the group who don't want to be there, who aren't voluntary participants in the socialist experiment. Now, unfortunately, practically every town and city and country has a population more than a few hundred or thousand. So it's not going to work, because what do you do with all of the people who don't want to be there? That will require then the totalitarian response. That will require the strong arm of the government to come in and coerce and oppress the people that don't want to be there. And that's the only way you can have a utopia is by bashing in a few heads. And well, again, unfortunately, that is even accepted as a premise for a lot of these leftist political activists. They totally acknowledge that. It's like the only way that they are going to get power is by bashing in a few heads. And again, unfortunately for some of them, it's like, well, however many people we have to kill, or to eliminate in order to get that utopia, it's going to be worth it. And that's the kind of mindset that motivates, I'd say, like, at least just the most reprehensible faction among the people in this kind of movement.
Well, I was thinking of just how of a fertile ground the U.S. is for this type of thinking and movement, in how narcissistic we have become and how narcissism has been nurtured among many people. So you mentioned Hicks is alluding to Nietzsche, and one of the ideas he brings up is Nietzsche's idea of resentment, which is, we all know about resentment, feeling bitter about something, feeling slighted, disenfranchised, laid low. Well, resentment is this kind of bitterness taken to this whole other extreme, where an individual experiences everything they are and everything they have and their future in this prism of being a victim, basically, of being the weak. But along with considering themselves weak would also go or be accompanied by these ideas about themselves as being kind of, like you were saying, Harrison, morally just. Some of the words that are used by Hicks are, well, let me just read a little bit from it, because it goes a long way in explaining the mindset of many of the people who fall prey to this type of thinking. What he says is, Nietzsche's concept of resentment is close to the English resentment, but with a more curdled bitterness, more seething and poisoned and bottled up for a long time. Nietzsche uses resentment in the context of developing his famous account of master and slave morality in Beyond Good and Evil, and more systematically in Genealogy of Morals. Master morality is the morality of the vigorous, life-loving, strong. It is the morality of those who love adventure, who delight in creativity, and in their own sense of purposefulness and assertiveness. Slave morality is the morality of the weak, the humble, those who feel victimized and afraid to venture forth into the big bad world. Weaklings are chronically passive, mostly because they are afraid of the strong. As a result, the weak feel frustrated. They cannot get what they want out of life. They become envious of the strong, and they also secretly start to hate themselves for being so cowardly and weak. But no one can live thinking he or she is hateful. And so the weak invent a rationalization that tells them they are good, and the moral because they are good, humble, and passive. Patience is a virtue, they say, and so is humility, and so is obedience, and so is being on the side of the weak and the downtrodden. And of course, the opposites of these things are evil. Aggressiveness is evil, and so is pride, and so is independence, and so is being physically and materially successful. But of course, it is a rationalization, and a smart weakling is never quite going to convince himself of it. That will do damage inside. Meanwhile, the strong will be laughing at him, and that will do damage inside. And the strong and the rich will be carrying on, getting stronger and richer and enjoying life. And seeing that will do damage inside. Eventually, the smart weakling will feel such a combination of self-loathing and envy of his enemies that he will need to lash out. He will feel the urge to hurt in any way he can his hated enemy. But of course, he cannot risk direct physical confrontation. He is a weakling. His only weapons are words. And so, Nietzsche argued, the weakling becomes extremely clever with words. So, this is a sad state of affairs. And getting back to Peterson, exactly why he's exhorting people to strengthen themselves, to take on responsibility, to choose a cross, first of all, an aim, a purpose, or things that are meaningful individually. And instead of trying to top down, change the entire system to make things better for themselves, even though ostensibly they're saying that it's to be better for everyone else, to make their own lives better, to take responsibility for their own lives. So it's not only cultural Marxism and postmodernism, and the socialist ideas that would have movements come and wreck things and start all over because this time it'll be different. But it's also this kind of unwillingness that individuals have of seeing the ways to empower themselves to become more individuated, to build themselves up financially, socially, and in whatever ways that would constructively make their lives better for themselves. So this is a bottom-up approach that would seem to be the most salutary for any individual who does feel disenfranchised to take for themselves. And this isn't something that this is the kind of diametrical opposite approach that postmodernism would have you take towards life, towards viewing the world, towards viewing yourself in the world, towards self-actualization. You're meant to project all of your dissatisfactions and all of your difficulties onto an oppressed other group and identify with them, and like you were saying before, Harrison, take this kind of righteous position that's supposed to be seen as selfless and noble and help the other guy. So it's a very deceptive strategy for life, and like I said a little bit earlier, I think most of the people who take this sort of mindset and approach, using words as weapons and projecting their own dissatisfactions onto the real or perceived injustices against others for their own. I mean, this is something that it's not a constructive strategy. It's something that's ultimately doomed to failure. Do you have anything to add to that, Corey?
Yeah, when you were saying that, I thought of the fact that in the world that we live in, the opposite of hell is not utopia. We don't get to have utopia. Clearly, it's not going to happen. But
we don't get to have nice things.
We don't get to have the best thing ever for all eternity. Heaven on earth is not going to happen. No matter how much you believe that you are God and that you can make it happen, that's just a gateway for Satan himself probably to manifest on the earth. But it's the opposite of utopia, or of hell, is responsibility, as Jordan Peterson has pointed out. Like, that's the closest thing that we can do to heaven and to making life better, is our own personal responsibility. And if that involves in some way helping others, if it's social justice, like actual form of social justice manifests because of that, then that's radically different than the social justice movement, trademark, copyrighted. It's because, as we've been pointing out in the show, at the very heart of it is this radical lie, a radical contradiction between power politics and relativism. And as you were pointing out, Harrison, that relativism goes a long way in terms of shielding yourself from criticism, because you believe that you are true and right and good no matter what, and that you decide that, you get to decide that, and nobody else gets to. And it also shields yourself, or prevents you, it blinds you from the truth. That radical switch between contradictory beliefs is very, very good at keeping you from actually being honest with yourself. And when you combine that kind of radical relativism and the lying to yourself and the lying to other people with the desire to control other people, then what you're manifesting on the earth, no matter how much you want to pretend or tell everyone that it's good, it's not. You're a blind tool at that point. And one thing that I wanted to mention about that way of treating facts as being your personal tool, your personal, it doesn't matter. It's all just a tool that I can use. I'll say this and it might not be true, but if it gets me what I want, then that's fine. Well, I remember reading a book by a psychoanalyst on the psychopathic mind. And he wrote in there that was his way of theorizing how the psychopath viewed the facts. Like, the psychopath knows that facts exist and knows basically what a fact is, but the psychopath has no respect for a fact. Like, the fact has no weight, no moral excitation, really, that you know that something is a fact, and so you respect it. It's external to you. You are subservient to it. It's a part of reality. So when you say these are the facts, for most people, that's just a self-evident, like the Declaration of Independence, self-evident truth. We hold these truths to be self-evident. The reality is reality. And there's no as soon as you believe that you can decide what reality is to suit your own whims, then you are embodying this psychopathic attitude towards reality. And then at that point, as soon as you've done that, as soon as your movement is treating reality in that way, then, like you said, Harrison, it's only a matter of time before you start seeing like all these fake hate crime hoaxes, these slanders, these lies used maliciously in order to attack other people, because the truth doesn't matter. The consequences to your actions don't matter. All that matters is that you get power, because deep down you still believe that you're good, but you've been blinded to what you're really doing. You've been completely blinded to what the people who are actually good and the thing that you're bringing into the world. You're not seeing it for what it really is. You're being used as a tool. And so, yeah, that's the bottom line. That's the problem. You think you're bringing utopia, but you are, the road, like they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And that's what we're seeing in real time, how it works. And you're taking everybody else down. You're ruining the progress that your movement that led to. The past 50 years, there's been tremendous progress. Nobody wants to see a loss of tolerance for the LGBTQ. Nobody wants to see a rise in racism, a rise in sexism. Mm-hmm. Nobody in their right mind who is actually a liberal wants to see these things. And so that's what really irritates a lot of people about the movement, is that, now you're starting to see a decline in tolerance. The several polls that we've had up on SOT the past week have shown a decline, 5-10% over the past 5 or 10 years, and it's probably only going to get worse because of this very sinister attempt to create their own reality blindly. It's going to backfire, and it is backfiring. And that's a frightening thing too. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, Corey, that and what's so especially awful about this sort of thing is that all of the more kind of let's say confident or mainstream minorities or groups like homosexuals and racial minorities, and they're all going to be victimized. They're all going to be kind of lumped in with the worst, most radicalized elements of their peer group, and that's the really sad thing. The other thing I wanted to comment on is this reminds me of a book, I think by Gary Zukav, that I'd read some time ago, where he talks about two kinds of power essentially. One is an authentic power, and one is a kind of external power, and where, ideally, most people have a kind of healthy balance between the two, or are at least working on an authentic power and, for lack of a better term, a soul strength or a mind strength, a kind of healthy sense of themselves and a healthy sense of what they're about and what they want to accomplish and what their values are and what they're respectful of and why. And there is this worship of all the trappings of external power that and narcissism that are unfortunately the kind of firmament from which many people grow out of, where they can't see themselves or haven't trained themselves or haven't been brought up to think about how their lives can be any other way outside of this really awful image of what a successful person or self looks like, and what they're about. So there's that, and if that's everything today, unless we had anything to add, maybe we'll bring this show to a close. And we thank you for listening today, folks, on Mind Matters. We look forward to seeing you again real soon. And until we meet again, take care.
Hit like and subscribe.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.